Welcome to Crosstalk Solutions. My name's Chris, and today we're going to be setting up the UniFi Protect UNVR from start to finish. Now, these instructions are going to work exactly the same whether you have a UNVR or the 7-drive bay UNVR-Pro. In our case, though, we just have the standard UNVR. This one is brand new. I just took it out of the box prior to turning on the cameras. And so, yeah, let's go ahead and get started. The first thing that you're going to want to do is install the hard drives. Now, as far as which hard drives to use for UniFi Protect, they do make specific surveillance hard drives, such as these Western Digital purple drives. But honestly, most any hard drive is gonna work in this thing, and then it's just a matter of performance, meaning how many cameras do you have attached to it versus the speed and quality of the hard drives. As far as size goes, I'm using Western Digital purple 8TB drives, but you can use drives, at least they've tested drives up to 16 terabytes in the UNVR. Now, they do make drives that are larger than 16 terabytes, so they would probably work, but they just have not been tested yet. Additionally, before you purchase any hard drives, I have a link down below in the description to a list of incompatible hard drives with the UNVR. And the incompatible hard drives are usually just hard drives that, where they have the screw holes don't line up with the drive trays on the UNVR. So there are a few drives that you're going to want to stay away from, but by and large, most hard drives will work in the UNVR. And that's if you have a 3.5-inch drive like these ones, or the smaller 2.5-inch drives. As far as how many drives to put into the UNVR, you can have anywhere from 1 to 4, and the type of RAID, or the type of redundancy across those drives, is automatically determined by the UniFi Protect OS running on this appliance. So if you have 1 drive, that's going to be no RAID. If you have 2 drives, that's automatically going to be mirrored, or what's called RAID 1. And then if you have 3 drives or 4 drives, that's automatically going to be RAID 5. For this install, I'm actually using 3 of these Western Digital 8TB drives. And you say, Chris, why are you using 3 drives? Why didn't you just use 4 drives instead? Well, honestly, I am using 4 drives for this, but the 4th drive has been back ordered and it is not in yet as of the recording of this video. So I'm going to set everything up with these 3 drives, and then I will probably redo the installation once I receive that 4th drive. Okay, so to do the installation of the drives, you first want to pop out your drive trays. I would start with the drives from left to right. If you have smaller than 4 drives, in my case I have 3, so I'm taking the first 3 drive bays over here. And we'll put this to the side for right now. When you are installing the drive into the drive tray, there are pictures here that show you how to do it, but ultimately you just want to have the pins on the bottom. And when you're lining it up, essentially, let me put the overhead view here. Here's the front of the drive tray. You want to line it up on this side first and then close it down. And now it's kind of locked into place. You can see that it's not coming out. The reason being is that there is a locking mechanism that lines up with the screw holes on the drives, and there's one sort of divot in the side of the metal here that you're going to line up that screw hole and then lock it down on the other side, where there are additional divots that are a little bit movable. They're a little bit malleable, so you can sort of slide the drive and then they click into place. An optional step, which I would recommend, is to use this one screw hole here to lock the drive into place. You don't have to lock the drive into place. As I showed you, the drive will not come out unless you shake it really hard or something. But just for extra safety and just for locking the thing down into the drive tray, you can put one extra screw right in this screw hole right here. And we can lock the hard drive in place. My 3 hard drives have been installed into the drive trays, and now it's time to put them in the UNVR. One thing to note, if you're going to be rack mounting your UNVR, there are rack mount ears that come with the solution that you will need to screw into the sides of the UNVR, and I would recommend actually rack mounting the UNVR in its home in the rack before you actually install the hard drives. That way you're not sort of jostling the thing around to get it into the rack with the hard drives already installed. It's going to be lighter to do it that way, and then you're just not jarring the hard drives at all. Okay, so move these over here. Let's get our UNVR back in place. And to install the drives, it's very simple. You simply line them up, push them in and close the front flap, and that's it. On the back of the UNVR, there are 4 different ports. We have this long black port right here. This is for the USP-RPS, or redundant power system. If you don't have that appliance from Ubiquiti Inc., then you do not need to worry about whatever's behind this black port right here. Then we have 2 network connections. We have a 1 gigabit Ethernet connection, and we have a 10 gigabit SFP Plus connection. In my case, I'm just using Ethernet, so I'm just gonna plug an Ethernet cable into the 1 gig port. However, if you're planning on using the 10 gig SFP Plus port, you're going to need an SFP Plus fiber module on both sides, as well as a fiber cable in between. And of course, you're gonna need a switch on the other side that supports 10 gigabit. Alternatively, you could use what's called a DAC cable, which is essentially the same concept. It's a fiber cable with SFP ends on it, but they're all sort of combined together in one cable. It's not like a separate SFP that you're plugging fiber into. It's one long cable that already has the SFP ends attached. And then finally over here we have the power. So we have network plugged in, we have our drives installed. Let's go ahead and turn on the UNVR. You'll notice that there's no power switch on the UNVR. In order to power it up, you simply just plug it in. Okay, so we are plugged in. We can see a white LED right here on the front, and pretty soon we should also see white LEDs on the hard drives. Once the white LED on the front is solid white, I would give it maybe 2 minutes after you plug it in till it gets to that stage. Then you're ready to start the adoption of this device into your network. Once you have a solid white light on the UNVR, you are ready to enter the initial setup wizard. This can be done in one of 2 ways. You can do it via a smartphone, Android or Apple, using the UniFi Protect app, or you can do it through a web browser, which is the way that we're going to do it here. In order to find the IP address of the UNVR, I was able to go into my firewall and look at the DHCP lease table, which showed me that my UNVR was automatically given the IP address of 192.168.1.10. When I enter that IP address into an internet browser, I get the step 1 of 6 UniFi Protect NVR installation wizard. So on this first step, we can give the device a name. In my case, I'm just going to call it UNVR. We're going to say agree to the terms of service and click next. And now it wants us to sign in to UI.com with our Ubiquiti Inc. single sign-on account. If you don't have a Ubiquiti Inc. single sign-on account, you can click create account right down here to create one. So let's talk about some login considerations here. You do not have the option of creating a local user only during the initial setup wizard of the UNVR. Because of that, make sure that your Ubiquiti single sign-on account has 2-factor authentication enabled as an extra measure of security. In terms of networking, there are also a couple of considerations. So considering that this is a cloud-connected device, if you were ever compromised, if anyone was able to get into your network and view your footage on your UNVR, extremely unlikely, especially if you have 2FA enabled, but if that ever happened, you wouldn't want there to be any way for those users to get into your other networks. So, best practice recommendation for surveillance systems, cameras as well as the NVR, is to completely segregate those devices into their own network or into their own VLAN. You can then create firewall rules to allow viewing of the camera footage through the VLAN or through the firewall in between your separate networks, and you can also prevent any of the devices in that network from getting out into your main LAN and potentially compromising anything else in your network. This is also a really good idea because imagine that you're a business and you have some cameras installed on the outside of the business. Someone could come by with a baseball bat, knock the camera off the wall, grab the Ethernet connection, plug it into a computer, and they now have access to your main LAN. So you want to make sure that that is completely segregated. If anyone ever tried something like that, they would have maybe internet access because the Protect device itself needs internet access, but they would not be able to compromise anything else in your main LAN or other networks that you might have in your business. Okay, so with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and sign into my UI.com single sign-in account. And step 3 of 6 of the wizard is asking us for the update schedule. How often do we want to update the UNVR. Again, this might be something you only want to do weekly. I'm just going to leave it at the default of daily at 12 a.m. By the way, you can also disable it if you don't want the UNVR to update automatically. But the UNVR is actually a really nice sort of set it and forget it device. So I don't mind having the updates on. Just, make sure everything's working periodically by checking your cameras. All right, we're going to say next. Now we have the option to help Ubiquiti developers improve UniFi. Diagnostics data will be sent to UniFi. You can enable that if you wish. I'm going to leave it disabled and click next. And finally, we have a summary of our installation where we are going to click finish. Step 6 of 6 is setting up your device, and I will come back as soon as this device has been set up and we are into UniFi Protect. Once you've finished the installation wizard and UniFi Protect has updated, you can now get to this screen here, and my UNVR is version 1.4.9 as of the recording of this video. At this point, you might want to click on this big Protect icon right in the front, but don't do that yet, because what we need to know about this interface is that there's essentially two layers. You have the UniFi OS, and then you have the apps that run underneath UniFi OS. Much like you have, Windows 10, and then you have apps that run on Windows 10, such as Office 365. So the OS, the UniFi OS settings, can be found down here at the bottom. We have settings, system settings, as well as users. You can also get to them by clicking these dots up in the upper right-hand corner, and then you have the same two options down here. The apps that are part of UniFi OS show up right here in the main section of the screen, and since this is a UNVR, the only app that we have available is UniFi Protect. If this was, for instance, a UDM Pro, a Dream Machine Pro instead, we would have 4 different applications here instead of just the one. So let's not click on Protect just yet. We want to come down here and click on System Settings. So we're taken to the general settings, and if we scroll down, we can see some information about the performance of the device, but then if we get down here to storage and capacity, we can see that my 3 hard drives are blinking green, and I have an estimated time remaining of 12 hours. Okay, so this is basically synchronizing the RAID 5 volume, which takes a pretty significant amount of time, but that doesn't mean that you can't start adding cameras and whatnot right away. It just means you're not fully redundant until those drives have synchronized completely. So let's talk about the hard drive storage for just a moment, because there are actually a couple of options here in the redundancy that I wasn't aware of. They must be new with this update. But in general, your hard drives are going to fill up with video footage, and once they're full, the oldest videos are archived off, right? So depending on how many cameras you have and the quality of those cameras, for instance, if you have a whole bunch of 4K cameras that are recording at the highest quality versus if you have a bunch of non-4K cameras recording at medium quality or 720p, you're going to get a lot more history in terms of days of recording history when you have cameras that are not recording in as high quality. And there are a couple of other options here. So we have redundant level. Now, redundant level, at the beginning of this video I said that it chooses RAID 1 or RAID 5 automatically, but now it looks like they've built in a couple of additional options. So we have one disk, which is essentially the old setting where you have, it'll auto choose between RAID 1 or RAID 5. A single disk will be used for data redundancy, or you can select half of disks, in which case it'll be RAID 10. Now again, keep in mind that there are massive differences in the amount of drive space available between RAID 5 and RAID 10. In RAID 5, if you have 4 8-terabyte disks, one of those will be set aside for parity, and you essentially have the full space of 3 of those disks, or 24 terabytes. With RAID 10, you have 2 sets of striped disks that are mirrored. So basically you have half the capacity. So if you have 4 8-terabyte drives, RAID 10, that's going to be 16 terabytes of redundant storage versus 4 8-terabyte drives RAID 5 is going to be 24 terabytes of redundant storage. So really it boils down to how much redundancy do you want in the system. And a lot of these options make more sense for the UNVR-Pro, which has 7-drive capability. The other option that we have down here is hot spare. So if you enable hot spare, you're telling UniFi Protect to reduce the total number of available disks by 1, and you're using that last disk as the hot spare, meaning that if there's a problem with any of the other disks in the set, the hot spare will automatically be put into place and you'll get notifications about, one of the disks has gone bad. In terms of total space though, again, this is something that you have to consider. If you have 4 8-terabyte disks and you have made one of them a hot spare, that means you have 3 disks that are RAID 5, or 16 terabytes of total storage, essentially cutting the total amount of disk space in half. For my purposes, I'm just going to leave both of these default to 1 disk redundancy as well as hot spare turned off. And then if you scroll down even further, we get to the network settings where you have different settings for the Ethernet port versus the SFP, the 10 gig SFP port. And if you want to set an IP address statically, this is where you do it. So I'm going to do that for this server. I'm going to change it to static. Gateway is 192.168.1.1, but the IP address that I'm going to give the device is 192.168.1.4 in a Class C subnet, or a /24 subnet. The reason that I'm doing that is I'm actually using this particular appliance to replace an old UniFi video appliance that's just starting to show its age, and I'm basically swapping it out with the same static IP address on my client's local area network. DNS servers we're going to leave this way, and we're going to click Confirm Changes. Keep in mind that when you set a static IP on a device like this and click Confirm Changes, the device's IP address changes, so now you have to change the browser URL to reflect the new IP address that you just set. Okay, so I've logged back in and I am at the new IP address. We are now going to go back to our system settings and let's click on Updates. So remember I said don't click on Protect just yet. That is because of this setting right down here. So we have set the UNVR to auto update, but that actually only updates UniFi OS, right? So the operating system level of the appliance. There's a separate switch to automatically update your applications, and that is turned off by default. So when you come in here, you might see status up to date on the UNVR, but Protect might show that an update is available. Now in this case, I've already run the Protect update, so I don't have to do that again, but just know that updating UniFi OS does not automatically update the Protect application running on UniFi OS unless you have this Applications button checked. One other thing to point out on this page is the release channel. You have the option to choose between the official release, a release candidate, or beta releases of UniFi OS. If you are going to be running a UNVR in production, I strongly recommend that you choose the official release channel, because you don't want to be messing around with any bleeding edge software that might contain bugs or things that are going to break the surveillance system. Next, if you click on location/time, this is going to allow us to position our UNVR, or basically set our address. This has to do with geofencing, which I don't think any of the current equipment takes advantage of geofencing, but UniFi Protect might have some stuff in the future that does take advantage of that. So you can set your address and time zone on this settings page. If we click into Advanced, we can rename the device. We can also enable SSH, which I would recommend doing. When you enable SSH, you have to set a password. Make sure it's a very strong password and something that you're going to remember, or keep it in a password manager ideally. And the reason that you want to install SSH or enable SSH is because there are some times when the UniFi Protect UNVR has a tendency to get stuck in an updating status. And there's really no way out of it other than to SSH into the device and manually run a command to fire off that upgrade. And then, of course, it'll successfully upgrade and you can break out of that sort of device updating cycle. So if you are installing this for the first time and you have a page that says device updating and it's just staying there forever, like longer than 15, 20 minutes, longer than an hour, you're gonna want to enable SSH and then SSH into the device to manually run a command to update it. And if you search around in the Ubiquiti forums, you can find information on how to do that. On this page, we also have the ability to disable remote access to the appliance. This is if you do not want to have access to UniFi Protect through unifi.ui.com But I would actually set up a couple of local users first before you do this, and we're going to get into the user management portion of UniFi Protect in just a little bit later in this video. Finally, if we scroll all the way down, we have our device controls: restart, power off, factory reset, and there's a support download in case you support requests that. If you are going to power off UniFi Protect, best practice is to log in here and make sure you hit this power off button. You don't want to necessarily just unplug it from the back of the device. Okay, so now I'm going to click the gear in the upper left hand corner. That's going to bring me back to the main dashboard, and at this point, let's go ahead and log into Protect, which is version 1.18.1 as of the recording of this video. Okay, so here we have the dashboard of UniFi Protect. At this point, I don't have any cameras. However, I did just plug in a UVC G4 Dome camera. And so let's go through the camera adoption process. When you plug a camera into the same local area network that the UNVR is also running in, the camera should just pop up automatically like you see up here in the corner, ready to add UVC G4 Dome. So all we need to do is click Add. And here we can see a preview of the device that we're adding, and we are just going to say Add Devices. Certainly if you have multiple devices, you will see multiple devices stacked up in that window. Oh, I just heard it chime over there on the side. Now, when you have clicked Add, the first thing that the UNVR or UniFi Protect is going to do is it will adopt that camera, check its firmware, and then update the camera's firmware to whatever version of Protect you're running, or whatever firmware comes along with the version of Protect that you're running. And as we can see here, it's doing exactly that. Link state says updating. So we're going to go ahead and let that camera update, and let's take a look around the interface. If we click in the upper left-hand corner, that's our Protect dashboard, and we can see some information about the UNVR. First of all, we can see that we have a direct connection as opposed to a connection through unifi.ui.com because we're going straight to the IP address of the UNVR. We can see the version, we can see our storage utilization, and right now I have this little info pop up next to 16 terabytes because it's indicating to me that the RAID has not fully synchronized yet, which we saw when we were in the UniFi OS settings page. This also shows us how many HD versus 4K cameras that we have running on the system. Any sort of events as well as the smart detections will start to populate in these areas once cameras have been adopted and they are online and working. If we click on the devices, we can see all of our various cameras as well as the UNVR itself, and we can click into our cameras and change whatever settings that we want. We'll get into that in just a little bit as that camera is still updating. Live View allows us to create different views for the UNVR, so if you want 4 cameras that are sort of in a grid or 10 cameras in a formation, you can basically create a view and then drag and drop cameras onto that view. Here we can see that the default view just popped up with the new camera that I adopted. It looks like it's updated and it's now online. And one thing to know about these views, it's kind of cool. If you have a grid of, say, 4 cameras, but you actually have 5 cameras, you can drop 2 cameras onto one of those grid squares, and it will actually cycle between those cameras, the 2 that are in that grid, based on either motion detection or based on a certain time interval, like if you want it to say every 10 seconds swap between these 2 cameras. So really cool to set up these views. You can also set up views for the UniFi Viewport, which is another UniFi Protect device that's basically an Ethernet on one side and an HDMI out on the other side, so that you can put the viewport plugged directly into a television or an HDMI monitor of some sort, and you can select which view that you've created in this views section will be displayed on that viewport, running on that television all the time, which is really great for like a little, security station setup or something like that. Back at the dashboard now, I went over and I did a couple of, events on the camera, and we can now see that our events are starting to be populated. The detections, you can select different types: motion events, smart detections, people detections, or vehicle detections individually. Those are both types of smart detections. And if you click on any of these events, it'll just play that event right here in the browser. And then from here we can change the speed. We have a couple of other options. We can turn the sound on and off. We can make it full screen, or we can actually download that clip by clicking the little download button. Let's go back to our devices down here, and we're going to click on the G4 Dome, and let's look at the options that you have for the cameras that you set up. So we have About. This just shows us information about the camera. If we click on General, we can rename the camera, which I certainly recommend so that you have a better reference for which cameras are where. Then you have microphone sensitivity, status sound, status lights, and then you have your overlay information. So here's so if we look at the camera picture again, the overlay information is what is displayed on this view. So right now, it's just the UniFi logo, right? But there's other stuff that might be more helpful to pop on here. So let's go ahead and close that out. The way that I like to set up my overlays is I turn on the time and date, I turn on the name of the camera, and then I turn off the UniFi logo. So let's go ahead and apply those changes and take a look at what it looks like now. All right, so after those changes, we can see that I have time date stamp as well as the name of the camera in the upper left-hand corner, and then down here, the UniFi logo is gone. When you're in this view, you can change between 720 or 4 megapixel, like high definition. You can also change the camera's settings, which I don't actually find to be too useful, but there may be instances where you want to do that. For instance, the orientation, if you have a camera that's, upside down, like a G3 Flex or something that you've installed upside down, you can change the orientation to flip that screen so that the images that you're viewing in Protect aren't also upside down. And there's also a whole bunch of different options for the picture quality and color and stuff like that. If we click on recording, this is when to record. We have it set on always, which I would recommend, but you can also choose to record never if you just want a camera that's only for viewing, or you can record only motion events. As far as recording quality goes, there's a couple of options here. You can turn on high frame rate mode. It says high frame rate mode gives you the ability to watch videos in slow playback and improves video latency. When enabled, some features are disabled, such as 4K recordings, HDR, that may decrease video image quality. So again, you can play with that setting, but it's basically for a higher frame rate as opposed to the standard frame rate, which varies from camera to camera. For the G4 Dome, we can see that the frame rate is 24 frames per second. And then again, image quality, if you are running out of storage space, or if you feel like you don't have enough history in terms of days of recorded footage, you can lower the image quality on your camera, but of course that's going to actually lower the picture quality of the camera as well. Then we have motion events. So how are we triggering motion, right? So the minimum number of seconds to trigger an event, I usually set this to 2 seconds, and then the seconds to record before the event was triggered and the seconds to record after the motion stops. So I would say 5 seconds and 5 seconds is what I usually like to set it at, meaning that it takes 2 full seconds of motion to trigger a motion event, but we are saving 5 seconds on either end of that motion event, because if someone's walking from further away, it may take a while for the camera to realize those 2 seconds of motion, and the 5 seconds of history before the 2 seconds of motion just gives us a little bit more to go back to. And we're going to click Apply Changes. Finally, we have our zones. So zones are motion zones and privacy zones. The motion zones are, for instance, if you had a camera on the front of your business and there was a busy street and you wanted to capture, sort of the sidewalk, but not have motion events triggered every time a car drives by, you can basically set the motion zone to only trigger in this specific area. Privacy zones work very much the same way, where you can mask out a section of the camera's view. This is usually used in cases where, if, for instance, you have the camera on the outside of your house, and in your area, it's illegal to film your neighbor's house. This is the rule of law in a lot of places, I think in Europe and elsewhere. So check your local laws for what's legal and illegal in terms of filming outside your own home. But let's say that this section of the screen over here was my neighbor's house. I can just add a new zone and then drag these dots where I need to in order to actually mask out whatever I don't want to see. And then in all of the footage, that section is just blacked out. Okay, finally, under each camera you have Manage. This allows you to reboot the camera, unmanage it if you want to remove it from UniFi Protect. You can also turn on various RTSP streams. So if you want to use these cameras with something like Home Assistant or with a third-party NVR, typically that's done using RTSP. And then you also have the option to disable the microphone on the camera if you like. All right, so we talked about devices, we talked about views. Let's go over to our events. So events is basically just all of your motion events, and you can filter by camera. You can also filter by just smart detections instead, where a smart detection is going to detect a vehicle or a person. Then we have time lapse, and time lapse is how you review footage. If you're trying to scrub through to find a particular event that isn't in your actual events, you can scrub through like this. And the scrubbing in UniFi Protect works better or worse depending on the quality of the camera and basically how quickly it needs to get through that footage. And also having the RAID synchronizing while I'm trying to do this doesn't help either. It's best to wait to go through the time-lapse history until your drives are fully synchronized. So you can also change the date up here, whichever day you want to scrub through, and then down here we have a download button that allows you to basically choose a section of footage that you want to bring in as an MP4 clip to download. Okay, so next we have roles. We're going to skip that for now and come back to that. Let's click on Activity. Activity just shows you a history of various activity for the UNVR and the cameras themselves. For instance, if a camera gets updated or if something goes offline or comes back online, you'll see that in the activity section. And then let's look at our Protect settings. So keep in mind, the Protect settings are different from the UniFi OS settings. Just like you can have Windows settings, in the control panel versus settings for an individual application like Microsoft Word. So here in general, we can basically see some information about the UNVR. If we click on backups, this allows us to download a backup and also set up daily backups. And when you set up daily backups, you'll see the most recent backup here, but you can click on View All Backups to see a full history of NVR settings that have been backed up. You can also just create a new backup of the current system if you want, or you can import a backup file to restore onto the UNVR. Under Advanced, we have the device password. So this is the password for each individual camera. If you ever want to log in directly to a camera to do something like factory reset it or whatever you might have to do, this is the password. So the username is UBNT. This is the password that gets you into that camera. And then we have this linked bridge devices, which is beyond the scope of this video, but it says linked bridge devices are access points from your network setup that can discover and pair protect Bluetooth devices such as the UP Sense, which I believe is a device that's not actually even out yet. Eligible models include the U6LR and the U6 Lite. And then you can also factory reset UniFi Protect down here at the bottom. If we click on recordings, we can turn on time-based purge. So time-based purging deletes footage from your hard drive once you've reached a maximum time limit. This can be required by law in certain areas. So if you are only allowed to keep 7 days worth of recording history, you can turn this on and then set it to 7 days before purging. If this is set off, which is how it is by default, it just means that all of your hard drives are going to fill up, and then once they're full, the oldest footage is deleted as new footage is brought in. Finally, you can click on My Alerts and enable activity alerts, and you can choose what type of alerts you want. Smart detections, motion alerts, connecting or disconnecting the cameras. This is helpful, but it can also be cumbersome, right? So there's a fine balance between the alerts that you receive, where you're not receiving so many alerts that you start ignoring them, and making those alerts actually useful. So like to me, I might want to know when certain cameras are disconnected. For instance, if I have cameras around the perimeter of my building and someone comes over and knocks off one of those cameras with a baseball bat, I want to be notified either by email or with a push to the UniFi Protect application that that camera has been disconnected. Same thing with motion detection and smart detections. Again, use these alerts at your own risk. They can quickly overwhelm you if you have too many alerts set up. You can also choose when to receive alerts, never, always, or on a custom schedule. For instance, if you only want to receive alerts after your company's business hours in case something happens during nighttime. Okay, next let's talk about roles and users. If you click on roles, which is this key icon right here, this allows you to set up different sets of cameras that users can either view only or actually edit and manipulate. So for instance, let's add a role here, and maybe we want certain users to only be able to view cameras from one building on our campus of buildings. So we're going to call this the Building A role. And then for device management, we wouldn't want to select all devices because we have cameras running across 5 different buildings. We only want to choose the cameras, either edit or view only, that this role or the people that are assigned to this role have permissions to view. So we're going to say, in this case, Building A, we'll say view only role. And they can view only the cameras that are in Building A, which I'm just going to select our G4 Dome, and we'll click Add Role. Now, let's get into the users. So the users are not in UniFi Protect. The users are in the UniFi OS operating system. We can get there by clicking these 9 dots in the upper right-hand corner and then choosing users. Right now, there's just one user, and it's me, because this is, I used my Ubiquiti single sign-on account to set up the UNVR. But let's go ahead and add a user. So we're going to click Add User up here. And the first thing we need to do is select Role here. Now, this role is different from the role that is actually in Protect. So this role is Member, which is only used for access and talk controllers, so it doesn't really apply here. Then we have Limited Admin or Super Admin. So let's go ahead and create a Limited Admin role. Now, when we've selected Limited Admin or Super Admin, we then have the account type. So this allows us to choose a Ubiquiti account where the person you're assigning this role to, this user, can utilize their Ubiquiti single sign-on account to log into UniFi Protect and to log in via unifi.ui.com remotely. If you select local access only, you're going to create a username and password for this user, and they do not have remote access to UniFi Protect unless you have specifically opened it up through your firewall and jumped through a bunch of hoops. That's a whole different story beyond the scope of this video. So imagine you basically have local users who can only log into the device on your LAN, or you have Ubiquiti account users who have a Ubiquiti single sign-on account and can log on to the device locally or through unifi.ui.com from anywhere. What I would recommend if you're going to get kind of a best practice setup is, what do your users need, right? Do your users need remote access? If so, then I would give them a Ubiquiti single sign-on account and allow them to be a Ubiquiti account type when you're adding them as a user. If they only need to be local, as in it's a security shack and they're only ever viewing the camera footage from that security shack while they're sitting right there at work, in that case you can just make them local users and they don't need remote access to all of your cameras. So let's change this to local access only. We'll call someone Dave Smith. Limited admin, local access only, username D Smith, and password, blah, 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 blah. Okay. And then down here for controller permissions, this is where we actually get to the role that we created in Protect that's running on UniFi OS, because now we can see the Building A view only role. And you want to select, you can multi-select which roles someone can view, because maybe you've got 5 buildings and you want someone to be able to view the cameras from Building A and Building B, but not from Building C, D, and E. And then we can click Add. All right, so now we have a new local limited admin that has been added to Protect. So the user stuff can be a little bit confusing, but just keep in mind that the majority of user management for Protect or any UniFi application is now done in UniFi OS, because you can marry those users across all of the different applications that are available, which would be UniFi Network, UniFi Access, UniFi Protect, and UniFi Talk. It makes less sense to do it that way on a UNVR, or it might not make as much sense, because the UNVR only allows for one application, UniFi Protect. So, well, why not just put it in UniFi Protect? Well, That's just the architecture of the UniFi solution, and it's just something you have to deal with. One additional tip that I will give you is when you create users for UniFi Protect, log in as that user and set up some default views and stuff for them, because oftentimes your users aren't going to know how to set up views. They're not going to know how to set up a 4-camera view or a 10-camera view or whatever. Just go in and set up some default views so that they have them. It's going to make your users appreciate you that much more that you have done that for them. Okay, so there you have it, a complete setup guide for UniFi Protect. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you have questions, comments, concerns, frustrations about UniFi Protect, any of that stuff, put it down in the comments below. I'd be happy to read those comments. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you give me a thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, please click subscribe. My name's Chris with Crosstalk Solutions, and thank you so much for watching.